In April 1945, during the last months of World War II, the last herd of the rare Lipizzaners horses was suddenly caught between the front lines. Soon they were in danger of being overrun by the approaching Soviet forces. In a last-ditch effort, the hostile forces of the US and Germany combined their efforts to infiltrate Soviet territory and rescue the horses. The risky operation was nicknamed Operation Cowboy. Please note, the following video documentary describes an historical event and should be viewed in its context. While Allied troops were advancing on virtually every front in April 1945, a small group of German soldiers were deployed to a small town in Czechoslovakia to look after breeding horses. These animals were so-called Lipizzaners, a very old and noble breed of horses originating in Slovenia. However, for this very reason, the German soldiers were afraid that something would happen to the horses as soon as the village of 1,000 souls, called Hostau, was overrun by the enemy. The Soviet forces were not far away, and it was told that they had already killed a lot of horses during the conquest of Hungary. With the death of the 350 Lipizzaners, the last breeding strain in Europe and thus an entire historical heritage would be lost. Especially Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Rudowski, commander of the German veterinarians, did not want to lose the animals under any circumstances and asked the ministry in Berlin many times how they should act in the event of approaching enemy forces. Since the answer was always to defend the position at all costs, Rudowski was torn between his loyalty as a soldier and his love for the animals. But everything was about to change with the arrival of Walter Holters, a colonel in the almost no longer existing German Air Force. From a purely strategic point of view, the stud farm is located in the area that the Soviet Union would soon conquer, but the US troops were not too far away either. In fact, a daring reconnaissance unit of the Americans had taken position about 30 miles away. It was the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, famed within German troops as Ghosts of Patton's Army for its deep strikes into enemy territory. This ability seemed tailor-made to evacuate the horses just in time before they would be discovered by Soviet troops. Meanwhile, Colonel Holters had arrived at the farm in Hostau, whose weather observation unit had no more significant use due to the shrinking German Luftwaffe. He shared Rudowski's passion for the noble horses and was amazed at the valuable breeding stock. In the face of advancing Soviet forces, he didn't want to leave the fate of the animals to chance and convinced Rudowski of a daring plan. He was to make contact with the Americans and, after a brief mock battle, allow himself to be captured and plead for the rescue of the animals as a senior German officer. Rudowski hesitated, but since it was probably the last chance to save the animals, he agreed. The venture succeeded, and just a few days later, Holters was sitting at the breakfast table with Colonel Reed, the commander of the American Reconnaissance Unit and also a horse lover. We found that we had mutual horse interests, and he showed me quite beautiful pictures of the Lipizzaners and Arabs, which he had recently taken at Hostau. We mutually agreed that these fine animals should not fall into communist hands, Reed later recalled of the conversation. A rescue mission would have been very dangerous as US troops were already engaged in heavy fighting and had few forces available. However, the reconnaissance unit used to ride on horses, and even though tanks had since replaced them, the word cavalry is still immortalized in the name. Many of the soldiers had still learned to ride in their training and therefore formed a close bond with the animals, which is why they immediately became enthusiastic about the operation. General Patton, the infamous commander of the American troops, was also a horse enthusiast and had even represented his country at the 1912 Olympic Games in show jumping, which is why he agreed to the rescue mission despite the risk. While the first Soviet shells were already hitting Hostau, the Americans also opened fire on their front section. It was a diversionary maneuver, while a small convoy of light tanks and transport vehicles detached from the main unit and advanced about 30 miles into the unknown area still occupied by enemy forces. The operation had to be kept top secret because even though they were allies, the Americans were advancing into an area that had been officially assigned to the Soviets. The German soldiers at the horse farm also had to be careful who they told about the operation. In a court-martial, they would have been punished for cooperating with the enemy, and a senior German general had even expressly forbidden Rudowski from any negotiations with the American troops. But the welfare of the animals was more important to both sides at this point. When the reconnaissance unit reached the farm, half the village, including the prisoners of war, formerly enlisted as laborers, stood by the roadsides cheering the liberators. Few shots were fired, and the German soldiers surrendered their combat gear without incident. The American soldiers who were not assigned as guards immediately ran to the stables and admired the graceful breed of horses. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Radovsky showed Reed the full extent of the farm, and it soon became clear that the evacuation of the 600 horses would require the full commitment of all forces. The stallions needed the guidance of an experienced rider, where the fact that many of the American soldiers had learned to ride horses came in handy. On the other hand, many mares on the farm were heavily pregnant or had given birth to foals only a few weeks earlier, so they could only be transported by truck. Fortunately, only a short time earlier, a German artillery unit had surrendered nearby, leaving behind numerous trucks that were confiscated by the soldiers. In no time, they converted the vehicles and even built improvised ramps to get the animals onto the high loading platforms. While the evacuation effort was in full swing, German infantry units, uninitiated in the plan, suddenly arrived with the goal of retaking Hostau. The American reconnaissance force was designed for a quick and easy march, not a prolonged engagement with a battered but still feared German army. Therefore, Colonel Reed had the previously liberated British, New Zealanders, French, Poles, and Serbs equipped with weapons to defend the farm. The German soldiers in Hostau also got back their previously surrendered combat equipment after promising to listen to the orders of the Americans. Last but not least, a Cossack prince who had previously fought for the Germans switched sides and supported the defenders with his experienced cavalry soldiers. Fortunately, since the enemy soldiers had no tanks, the multinational forces managed to repel the attack after 2 fierce battles. Order was restored at the stud farm, and after all preparations were completed, the convoy of riders, horses, and trucks, hundreds of meters long, marched slowly towards Bavaria, which was occupied by U.S. troops. They escaped just in time. While the horse farm disappeared in the background, Soviet T-34s were already appearing on the horizon. However, the Red Army avoided further confrontation and let the unit move. Once the horses were safe, Lieutenant Colonel Radovsky and his men were officially considered prisoners of war, but they were treated honorably. Some veterinarians even received official employment and were able to continue caring for the horses they had nursed for years. Some of the Lipizzaners were eventually flown to the U.S. and initially kept by the military before being sold to private individuals. However, most of the breeding stock was returned to the original owners in Yugoslavia and Austria in the following years. Thus, German-American cooperation had ultimately saved the historic court stud of 2 countries and returned almost all of the horses to their homelands. A friendly relationship developed between many of the officers involved in the daring endeavor, and their passion for horses unites them to this day. They can be proud of their deeds. In 1963, Walt Disney even released a film about the events called Miracle of the White Stallions, which received great popularity as family entertainment. Operation Cowboy is only one of 2 events between 1939 and 1945 in which American soldiers fought side by side with the Germans. The other scenario was the battle for Castle Itter. If you would like to see a video of this story as well, feel free to leave a comment. For those who made it this far, thank you very much for watching. We put a lot of research and work into our videos and appreciate the positive feedback. If you want to support us, feel free to check out our store where we offer merchandise, free wallpapers, and much more. See you next time!